On Monday, June 4th, 2012, 34-year-old Eric Samoa stood between two brand-new Jaguar cars on the showroom floor of a luxury car dealership in Bethesda, Maryland. Eric was talking to a potential new car buyer. Eric was this dealership's top salesperson, sometimes pulling in between $10,000 and $20,000 US in commission checks every month. Eric was very handsome. He wore a well-fitted black suit and a red tie, and he was tall with a shaved head, brown eyes, and a goatee. Eric smiled at his potential customer, told him a joke, and then put his hand on the guy's shoulder like they were old friends. But pretty quickly, Eric sensed this guy was not actually ready to buy a car just yet. Still though, Eric had not become the top salesperson at this dealership by giving up at the first sign that the customer is not fully committed. Instead, Eric just continued talking and listening to the guy, doing his best to establish a real connection. That way, when this guy came back and was ready to buy a car, he would hopefully come back to Eric. The potential customer walked around one of the Jaguars and told Eric he would definitely think about buying it. He said he loved how it looked, he just needed to talk to his wife first. Eric said he totally understood, and then he handed the guy his business card and walked him out of the showroom and said he looked forward to meeting with him again. Then Eric turned and walked back across the showroom floor, past all the polished, perfectly lit cars, into a bright carpeted hallway that led to the break room and a few offices. Eric walked into his manager's office and said he was taking off for the day. His manager told him to have a good night, and Eric just grinned, because he definitely had a good night planned, and he couldn't wait to get it started. About 15 minutes later, Eric pulled into the parking lot of his high-rise luxury apartment building in Silver City, Maryland, a suburb of Washington, D.C. The apartment building was the type of place that catered to young professionals, with a rooftop pool and plenty of bars and restaurants within walking distance. Eric walked into the lobby and took the elevator up to the 6th floor, where his place was. Once inside his apartment, he went right to the kitchen and poured himself a drink. Then he headed to his bedroom and changed into black jeans and a black t-shirt, and then he walked out onto a small balcony. He left the door open behind him. Out on his balcony, Eric sipped his drink as he watched the local restaurants and bars down below come to life. Eric loved this part of town, and he loved his apartment, especially because he'd had to work so hard to be able to afford it. Eric was the youngest of 4 children born to immigrant parents from Ghana. And when Eric and his siblings were kids, their parents had told them that the United States was filled with opportunity, and that in the United States, they could be anything they wanted as long as they worked really hard. So Eric had grown up basically believing the American dream was true, that if he put in the work, he would be successful. And looking out from his balcony inside of his upscale neighborhood, Eric felt like he was definitely on the right path. Selling luxury cars had really paid off. He made great money, and he had no intention of slowing down. Just then, Eric heard a knock at his door. He turned around and walked through his apartment and put his glass down on the coffee table, then opened up the front door and saw a 34-year-old Katrina standing there. Katrina smiled, got up on her toes, and threw her arms around Eric's neck and gave Eric a big kiss. Then they both went inside, and Katrina curled up on the brown leather couch in front of the TV, and Eric went to the kitchen to pour Katrina a glass of wine, and then he joined her on the couch. Eric and Katrina had been seeing each other for a few months, but they were still keeping things really casual. They had met outside of the apartment building and discovered right away they had a lot in common. Katrina shared Eric's really strong work ethic, and it's what allowed her to become a nurse. They also both loved basketball, and so their relationship consisted of basically hanging out a couple of times a week, watching a basketball game together, and then spending the night together. And that night in particular, they were both really excited because there was this big NBA playoff game on. And so, sitting on the couch, Eric and Katrina talked about who they thought was going to win the game, and then they also talked about how their jobs were going. But Eric looked a bit distracted. He kept picking up his phone and checking the time. Finally, he just turned and asked Katrina if she was up for going on a quick ride before the game started. Katrina figured he just wanted to go out and maybe pick up some food or something, but no, Eric told her he actually wanted to go meet a guy who he could buy marijuana from. He said the guy lived close and it wouldn't take very long. Katrina was surprised. She knew Eric occasionally smoked weed, but he'd never asked her to go buy weed with him. Still, she figured it wasn't that big of a deal. They were in a really nice suburb, so how dangerous could this weed dealer really be? So Katrina told him that was fine, as long as they got back in time for the start of the game. Eric promised they wouldn't miss a thing. Then he and Katrina left the apartment, went down the elevator, and out to Eric's car. After driving for a few minutes, Eric turned onto a side street in front of a small apartment complex, and he pulled over to the curb and put his car in park. To Katrina, the street seemed totally empty, but suddenly the back driver's side door opened, and this tall, skinny-looking drug dealer with a scraggly beard slid into the back seat. The dealer quickly handed a paper bag over the seat to Eric, and Eric took the bag, he looked inside, and he saw a Ziploc baggie of marijuana, and after he was satisfied, he handed the cash back to the dealer. The dealer then hopped out of the car without a word, closed the door, and disappeared back into the apartment complex. The entire exchange took less than a minute. Eric turned and smiled at Katrina, and then he turned the car back on, and he drove them back to his place just in time to watch the opening tip-off of the playoff game. And then later that night, after the game was over, Eric and Katrina went to bed together. Then, right before Katrina actually went to sleep, she reminded Eric that she had to work early the next day, so pretty likely when he woke up in the morning, she'd be gone. Eric said he totally remembered, then he kissed Katrina goodnight, and the couple rolled over and they both drifted off to sleep. And hours later, in the early morning of June 5th, 2012, Eric was still asleep in his bed when somebody walked into his bedroom, walked across the floor, and stood right beside him, staring down at him as he slept. The following day, so June 6th, Eric's manager at the luxury car dealership sat in his office trying to get a hold of Eric on the phone. Eric was supposed to work that day, but he hadn't shown up, and his phone kept going to voicemail. Top salespeople like Eric occasionally took what everybody at the dealership called unscheduled days off, but Eric always made sure to let his manager know if he wasn't going to come in, and he hadn't on this day. So the manager walked to the showroom floor and talked to a couple of other salespeople, but none of them had heard from Eric either. The manager started to get worried, so he went back to his office and he called Eric's emergency contact, who was one of his older sisters. The manager told Eric's sister he didn't want to upset her, but he hadn't seen or heard from Eric that day. Eric's sister was totally frightened by this, and she immediately called Eric, and when he didn't answer, she called her other sister and her other brother to see if they had heard from him. But they too had not talked to Eric in at least a couple of days. Eric's sister, the one who the car dealership manager had called, had a really uneasy feeling. Eric talked or texted with at least one of his siblings every single day, and so Eric's sister felt like, this was an actual emergency, and so she took a deep breath and dialed 911. After explaining what was going on with Eric, the 911 operator said that police would send officers by Eric's apartment to do a wellness check on him. Eric's sister thanked the dispatcher, and then she went right to her car and raced across town to Eric's apartment building. A little before 5 p.m., Eric's sister waited downstairs in the apartment complex lobby while a building manager led 2 police officers up to Eric's apartment on the 6th floor. One of the officers knocked on Eric's door but got no response, so the building manager unlocked the door and stepped back. At that point, the officers stepped forward, walked inside, and began calling out to see if anybody was home, but again, there was no answer. So the officers walked across the apartment, down a short hallway, and came to a closed bedroom door. One of the officers knocked, but there was still no answer, so they opened up the door and walked inside. And there was Eric laying in bed. There was a sheet that was pulled up all the way up to his mouth. The officers walked over, and they saw there was a single gunshot wound to Eric's head. Both officers thought it looked like Eric Samoa had taken his own life. The officers quickly went back downstairs, and when they got there, one of them placed his hand on Eric's sister's shoulder. He said he was so sorry, but they had found her brother deceased upstairs in his bed. Eric's sister let out a shriek that echoed off the lobby walls. She started wailing and crying. She could not believe her little brother was gone. About 45 minutes after Eric's body was discovered, Detective Dimitri Ruvin of the Montgomery County Police Department walked into the lobby of Eric's apartment building. He saw officers standing with 2 women and a man who were huddled together and crying. Ruvin was one of the youngest detectives on the force, but he did have experience, and other cops basically envied him for his seemingly boundless energy. He waved one of the officers over, and the officer told him the people in the lobby were Eric's siblings. Reuven asked the officer to let them know that he would be down shortly to talk to them. Then Reuven quickly walked across the lobby and took the elevator up to the 6th floor. Reuven walked through Eric's apartment, and he understood why the first officers on the scene had thought Eric killed himself. The door to the apartment had been locked when they arrived, and there was no sign of forced entry, and expensive items like Eric's computer and TV had been left untouched, so this didn't look like a robbery gone wrong. Reuven stepped into the bedroom, and he saw that Eric had a single bullet wound in his head, another sign of a possible suicide. But Reuven searched the entire bedroom and didn't find a gun, so he knew the officers had been wrong. There was no way Eric had shot himself. Someone clearly had shot him. Reuven looked down at Eric's body, and for whatever reason, he felt this instant connection with the guy. He couldn't really explain it. He'd worked a lot of homicide cases, and he always felt sympathy for the victims. But this was something different. This was more personal. Reuven told himself that the reason for this connection must just be because Eric looked to be about the same age as Reuven. It was like, here's this guy with every opportunity in front of him, and somebody took that away from him. And this just made Reuven really upset and angry. It just seemed so wrong. Reuven took out his phone and called the station to let his boss know that this was a homicide, not a suicide, and so he would need an investigative team sent over. And not long after that call, forensics analysts arrived at Eric's apartment and began sweeping through it. And they would discover a single .380 caliber bullet casing in the bedroom, but there still was no sign of a gun anywhere. They also did a sweep of the apartment for fingerprints and possible DNA samples, but they knew that type of evidence might not get them very far in this case. The fact that there was no sign of forced entry or any kind of struggle meant there was a good chance Eric knew his killer. So the analysts figured they would just find lots of prints of friends or family who were often at Eric's place and so were not suspicious, and any of them could be guilty. And Reuven knew right now 3 of Eric's family members, his sisters and brother, were down in the lobby waiting to talk to him. So Reuven let the forensics team continue their work, and then he headed back downstairs. The elevator doors opened, and Reuven could hear Eric's siblings still crying in the lobby. Reuven walked slowly now, and he heard the sound of his shoes clicking on the concrete floor. He hated this part of the job. Eric's siblings only knew that their brother had been found dead in his apartment. They didn't know what happened. So Reuven lowered his head and approached them, and he told them he was so sorry, but their brother had actually been murdered. That sent Eric's brother and sisters into another fit of screaming. Detective Reuven stood with them and let them get as loud and as angry as they wanted. Then eventually, one of Eric's sisters caught her breath and wiped the tears from her eyes, and she looked right at Reuven, and she told him he needed to speak with a woman named Denise Harrington. Reuven asked who Denise was. Eric's sister said Denise was Eric's girlfriend, and she was no good. She was 20 years older than Eric, and his entire family knew Denise was just using Eric for his money. Reuven thanked Eric's siblings for their time, and he said police would follow up with them soon. Then he offered his condolences again and headed back upstairs. When he got there, he could tell, after hours and hours of searching this apartment, really the only thing investigators had found so far was just that bullet casing. But Reuven felt like this Denise person was a really strong lead, and so it didn't really matter right now that they didn't have much evidence. So Reuven found the phone number for Eric's girlfriend, Denise, gave her a call, and when she picked up, he told her he needed to meet with her to ask some questions about her boyfriend. The day after Eric's body was discovered, members of Reuven's team re-interviewed Eric's brother and sisters and looked into other family members who might have spent time at Eric's apartment. But Reuven himself remained focused on Eric's girlfriend, Denise. At the station, he led Denise into an interview room, sat across from her at a small wooden table, and handed her a bottle of water. He thanked Denise for coming in, and then asked her if she understood why she was there. And she just said, I understand there's some questions about Eric. Reuven nodded, and then asked her very gently if she knew that Eric had been killed. A look of total shock came across Denise's face, and she just began shaking her head, no, and then just said she couldn't believe it. People loved Eric. Reuven watched Denise very closely. She looked genuinely surprised and upset about this news, but he knew some people were naturally just very good actors. Looking at Denise now, it also struck Reuven how big the age gap was between her and Eric. Eric's family clearly had not approved of a woman 20 years older dating their little brother, but Reuven did not think being older than Eric somehow made Denise more suspicious. Reuven asked Denise if it was strange that she hadn't heard from her boyfriend in the last couple of days, before he was killed, but she told him it was not strange that she hadn't heard from Eric because Eric was actually not her boyfriend. Not anymore, anyways. Reuven was confused. Eric's siblings seemed very certain that Denise was seeing Eric and using Eric as far as they were concerned, but Denise explained that she and Eric had hit a rough patch about a month earlier. She found out he was obviously cheating on her when she noticed text messages coming into his phone from 2 other women. And so Denise just did not want to be treated that way, and so she had ended it with Eric, like their relationship was done and she had not talked to him in a while. And Denise said, if somebody close to Eric thought that she, Denise, and Eric were still together, it was probably only because Eric had not told anybody about the breakup. Denise felt like, Eric likely wanted his family to think he was settling down and not still going out and seeing a bunch of different women at the same time. Finally, Reuven asked Denise where she was on the night of the murder, and she said she'd been at home and said police could check her phone records that would prove she was telling the truth. Reuven thanked her for her cooperation and said he would be taking her phone now so they could download the information to help corroborate her alibi. And a little later that day, after police had finished downloading the information from her phone, Reuven gave the phone back and let Denise go. And while Reuven did think Denise was genuinely shocked when she heard the news about Eric, he couldn't help but think, Denise had a clear motive to want to harm Eric. Eric was cheating on her, and a jilted lover almost always had to be considered a viable suspect. But for now, Reuven would just have to wait until his team went through all of that information downloaded off Denise's phone to figure out if she really was a viable suspect. So in the meantime, Reuven headed back up to the 6th floor of Eric's apartment building to talk to some of Eric's neighbors. Reuven knocked on a door that was nearby Eric's apartment, and a guy in his 20s answered. The young man did not look surprised to see a detective standing there. He said he knew Eric pretty well, and he knew Eric had been killed. Then, without being prompted, he told Reuven the police should really question Eric's girlfriend. Reuven said he'd already met with Denise, but the young man just kind of stared at him, and then he said no, Eric's girlfriend's name was not Denise, it was Katrina. If you recall, Katrina was the woman who watched basketball with him on the night he was killed. The neighbor told Reuven that Katrina lived in the apartment building, and he had seen Eric with Katrina a bunch of times. Reuven thanked the young man for his help, and then the door shut, and then Reuven just stood there in the hall thinking. Denise had mentioned during her interview that 2 women had been texting Eric, which is how she had figured out he was cheating on her, but neither of those 2 women were named Katrina. And Eric's family had never mentioned anybody named Katrina at all. And so now, Reuven thought he might have a jilted lover in Denise and a secret lover in Katrina to consider as suspects. Reuven really wanted to make sure he was fully prepared before he brought in Katrina for an interview, so he and his team did some digging. They found out Katrina was from Mississippi, and she had come to Maryland a few months earlier to work as a nurse for the National Institutes of Health, a government organization focused on public health research. But much more important than that, at least to Detective Reuven, was that several people in the apartment building saw Eric and Katrina together on the night before Eric was killed. A couple of days after Eric was killed, Detective Reuven found himself back in an interview room talking to a woman he thought was Eric's girlfriend. And just like he had done with Denise, he started the interview by asking Katrina if she knew why she was there. And Katrina, who had a sort of confused look on her face, told him that, she understood she was here to help with some investigation, but she hadn't been given any more details than that. She figured it might have something to do with where she worked, but she didn't know. At this point, Reuven told her point blank that her boyfriend, Eric, had been found murdered in his apartment, and that she was the last person anybody had seen him with. Immediately, a look of complete disbelief came across her face, and as she pulled her legs up onto her seat and grabbed her knees with her arms and began rocking back and forth, she began saying to Reuven that, why would anybody want to do this? Everybody loves Eric. And then she asked Reuven, is it possible that this was not Eric? But Reuven said no, this was definitely Eric, and he is definitely deceased. At this, Katrina clutched her knees even tighter, and then she looked up at Reuven with a very sad look on her face, and she said, she just felt so guilty. For the past couple of days, she'd been furious at Eric because he had not been responding to any of her text messages. And so she thought he was just being a jerk for some reason, but now she knew why he wasn't responding. It was because he was dead. That realization was like too much for Katrina to handle, and for a minute, it seemed like she might have a total breakdown. But then she stopped rocking in her chair, and she put her feet on the floor, and she leaned forward. It was like something had just clicked in her mind. She told Reuven that something really strange had happened on that last night that she was with Eric. Reuven leaned in and asked Katrina to please walk him through everything she could remember about that night. Katrina took a deep breath, and then she began speaking. She said she and Eric had met up to watch basketball, but they left his apartment so Eric could go buy some weed. Then, after Eric got his weed, the couple went back to Eric's apartment, they watched the game, they had sex, and then they went to sleep. None of this seemed very out of the ordinary to Reuven, and he was about to say as much, but Katrina said, hold on, the weird part happened the next morning. She said the next morning when she woke up around 5 a.m., because she had to get up really early for work, she had looked over and Eric was not in the bed. Then she heard voices coming from some other room. She thought maybe Eric was on the phone, so she just got dressed, grabbed her things, and walked out of the bedroom, and the drug dealer who had sold Eric the marijuana the night before was standing right there. Katrina said this totally freaked her out. Doing, a quick weed deal in the car was one thing, but having a drug dealer in the apartment at 5 a.m. seemed wrong to her. And being a nurse for a government organization, she did not want to be associated with any drug dealers. But that wasn't all. Katrina said when she looked at this dealer, this tall, skinny guy with a scraggly beard, he seemed really agitated. And when Katrina told Eric she was leaving, the dealer turned and looked at her and walked over, grabbed her arm, and basically rushed her out of the apartment and then shut the door behind her. Reuven got Katrina to give him as many details as she could about the dealer and about the location where he had sold Eric marijuana the night before, and after taking all that down, Reuven stopped for a second because he thought of something. He asked Katrina, why didn't you check in on Eric later in the day or really at any point over the next couple of days when he wasn't responding to her text messages? Like the last thing you saw was Eric alone in his apartment with this sketchy drug dealer who rushes you out the door and shuts the door behind you. You said the drug dealer seemed agitated, so what? You just figured everything was fine and you just didn't think to follow up? Katrina could see how suspicious it seemed, but she explained to Reuven that her relationship with Eric was very casual. They basically were not a girlfriend and boyfriend, they were not a couple, they were just kind of hooking up periodically, and that was it. And so Katrina said, she just was worried that if she really aggressively followed up trying to get in touch with Eric and, went over to his place to check on him, that might come off to Eric like she was this really obsessed girlfriend, and she just didn't want that. And then over the course of a couple of days, when Eric did not get in touch with her, she got mad at him. Why is he not getting in touch with her? And so it just kind of led to this silence. Reuven nodded and then thanked Katrina for coming in and told her he would be in touch if he needed more information from her. Not long after Katrina left, Reuven's team worked to track down that drug dealer. And with Katrina's description of him and the exact location of where Eric purchased that marijuana from him, it didn't take them very long to find this guy. His name was William Woodfork, and he quickly became the focus of Reuven's investigation. A couple of days after the interview with Katrina, Reuven sat back down inside the interview room with William Woodfork. William was tall and lanky with a patchy beard, just like Katrina had described, and he was very, very nervous seeming. He was having a really hard time sitting still. Police had not told William why he was here, and so Reuven figured William was likely very worried about getting busted for dealing drugs. But Reuven acted like he didn't notice, and he just casually reached into a folder and pulled out a photo of Eric, and he placed it on the table in front of William, and he said to William, "This man right here in this photo is a guy named Eric, and he was just murdered." And then Reuven asked William, "How long have you known Eric?" William looked down at the photo, and after staring for a second, he just shook his head and said he'd never met the guy. Reuven smiled a very knowing smile and then told William it was not a good idea to be lying to the police. This is a homicide investigation. This is about as serious as it gets. Reuven told William he had Eric's phone records, so he knew William had texted Eric the night before Eric got murdered. Immediately, William hung his head and stared at the floor and then began backtracking. He admitted to Reuven that actually he had sold Eric weed a few times, including on that past Monday night. At this point, Reuben stopped smiling, and he immediately asked William, "Okay, fine, you sold him weed on Monday. Why did you go to Eric's apartment early on Tuesday morning at around 5 a.m.? William immediately looked up and told Reuben he was not some big-time drug dealer out settling scores. He's like, "I had nothing to do with Eric getting killed." But Reuben was not about to take the word of someone who had literally just lied to his face. And with the phone records and William admitting he saw Eric the night before the murder, Reuben felt like he had more than enough evidence to pursue this lead further. So, not long after that meeting, Reuben secured a warrant to search William's apartment. And when they did search his apartment in the week following Eric's murder, police would find a .380 caliber handgun, the same type of handgun that had been used to kill Eric. And so Detective Reuben was pretty much positive he had just found Eric's killer. But later that week, when the ballistics report on Williams' gun came back, it showed the ammunition used in his gun did not match the bullet casing that was found in Eric's bedroom, meaning this gun was not the murder weapon. Reuben was not willing to totally eliminate William as a suspect. It just seemed too coincidental that this guy would happen to have a .380 caliber handgun in his apartment, but it could be just a bizarre coincidence. And without more compelling evidence, he knew any case brought against William would not hold up in court. And so suddenly, Reuben felt like this investigation had just stalled in a major way. Investigators went from believing they had their killer right back to having no idea who they were even looking for. And at the same time, Reuben began getting daily calls from Eric's sisters, but he had no new information to share with them. And Reuben told other investigators that he felt like he was letting Eric's family down. Weeks passed without any new leads coming in, and then several months went by, and pretty soon this case became much less of a priority for the department. But Reuben refused to let the case just go cold. In fact, he put a photo of Eric on his desk to remind him of the job he still needed to do. And he continued to talk to Eric's sisters almost every day, and he promised them as long as he was on the force, he would never stop looking for their brother's killer. In May of 2013, almost a year after Eric's murder, Detective Reuben continued his investigation. But almost no new evidence had surfaced, and so he was basically running out of ideas. Reuben pored over Eric's case files whenever he could, looking for anything that he might have just overlooked. And there was one piece of evidence, or really a missing piece of evidence, that had always bothered him. The gun that had been used to kill Eric had never been found. So now, Reuben decided to try something he knew was a total long shot, but he felt like he had nothing to lose. Police often confiscated guns as evidence in investigations, and they occasionally received guns that people had simply found and turned into them. So, Reuben reached out to every police department in the county and asked for a list of all the .380 caliber handguns they had received in the past year, either confiscated as evidence or turned into them by a Good Samaritan. The other departments all cooperated, and soon Reuben ended up with this list of 60 .380 caliber handguns. And then Reuben began the painstaking work of tracking down the history of each of those 60 guns. And the first 58 guns led him nowhere. But when he began looking into the 59th gun on the list, he thought he might have found something promising. That gun had been found discarded on the side of the road on the Capitol Beltway, one of the busiest streets in Washington, D.C. The man who had handed this gun over to police had been sitting in bumper-to-bumper traffic and just happened to look over and see the gun lying on the side of the road. And that spot on the Beltway was not very far from Eric's apartment. But there was another detail in this report about this 59th gun that gave Reuben the biggest jolt of energy he'd felt in almost a year. The man who found this gun had found it just 2 days after Eric's murder. Using the 59th gun's serial number, Detective Reuben tracked down the weapon's original owner, but that man told Reuben he'd actually sold the gun at a pawn shop years earlier, and so Reuben found that pawn shop and got their sales records for the gun. And from there, Reuben started tracking down every one of the gun's previous owners, and there were quite a few of them. And this process dragged on for weeks and weeks, but finally, right around the actual 1-year anniversary of Eric's death, Reuben talked to a man who had sold this 59th gun to a pawn shop just a few months before Eric was killed. And so Reuben felt like there was a legitimate chance that whoever had bought the gun from this latest pawn shop was the killer. Now, the pawn shop was nowhere near Reuben's police station, but he decided he would take a trip there, hoping all of his work would pay off. So, on a hot and humid June day, Detective Reuben, along with several other officers, walked into the pawn shop on the outskirts of a small rural town. Reuben thought it was the kind of place someone would never find unless they already knew it existed. The pawn shop owner greeted Reuben from behind the counter in a very thick southern drawl, and he asked how he could help. Reuben told the owner he was looking for sales records on a particular gun, and then he gave the owner the serial number of the gun. But the owner right away just sighed and said he was really sorry, but he couldn't do that. He'd stored those sales records in diaper boxes out in a shed behind the shop, and earlier that year, rats had gotten into the shed and started gnawing away at all the diaper boxes. The owner was worried he would lose the records to the rats, and he knew losing gun sale records could get him in big trouble with the federal government, so he handed over all those records inside of the chewed-up diaper boxes to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, or the ATF. The ATF is a United States government agency that primarily monitors firearms trafficking. Reuben just stood there and stared at the pawn shop owner. He felt like laughing at how absurd this was. He never imagined diaper boxes and rats would play a role in his homicide investigation, but here he was. And so ultimately, Reuben thanked the owner and then left the pawn shop and headed back to Montgomery County, Maryland, to the police station. And once he got there, he called an ATF agent that he knew and told him what had happened. Reuben offered to go to ATF storage and personally dig through all the chewed-up diaper boxes himself, but the agent assured him the ATF would find whatever he needed. And on June 12, 2013, so over a year after Eric's murder, Reuben got a call at his desk from that ATF agent. And the agent told Reuben that they had just tracked down all those diaper boxes, and they had found the specific report Reuben was looking for, and so he was faxing the report over right now. Reuben thanked the agent and hung up the phone, but as soon as he did, he felt so nervous. It was like every muscle in his body was getting tense. He knew if this report that he was about to read didn't give him any new information, he would have no idea what to do next. And so as he was thinking about this, he looked over at the photo of Eric on his desk and just held his breath. The fax machine near his desk started printing out the report. Reuben got up, walked over to the machine, grabbed the report, and began to read through it. And as he did, Reuben felt like a huge weight had been lifted off his shoulders. After more than a year of investigating this case and weeks of tracking down gun owners all over the place, Reuben knew, based on this report, that he could call Eric's siblings right now and tell them he had found their brother's killer. Based on records from the ATF and evidence collected over the course of a year, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Eric Samoa in the early morning hours of June 5th, 2012. The killer was standing at the foot of Eric's bed, watching him sleep. They'd been standing there for a few minutes, just staring, but they knew now it was time to act. So they reached into their bag that was slung over their shoulder and pulled out a .380 caliber handgun. The killer then walked forward until they were right next to Eric, trying to be as quiet as possible. They didn't know what Eric would do if he suddenly woke up. And so at this point, the killer kind of leaned over Eric until they were so close to him they could actually feel Eric's breath on their cheek. Then they slowly pulled up their gun and aimed it basically point blank at Eric's forehead, and then they fired. The bullet lodged inside of Eric's brain, and he died without ever waking up. The killer quickly tossed the gun into their bag and then pulled the bedsheet up to Eric's mouth to try to cover up some of the blood. Then the killer ran out of the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind them. They opened up the front door, they locked the doorknob, and then closed it, and then they ran down the hallway to the elevator. As the elevator was making its way down, the killer took several steadying breaths, doing their best to look as calm as possible. When the elevator doors opened, the killer walked across the lobby, went out to the parking lot, got in their car, and began driving towards Washington, D.C. Now, it was still dark out, and the killer saw headlights up ahead from a line of cars driving towards the city, and so since they didn't want to get caught in traffic, the killer just hit the gas and whipped down the road. The killer reached the Capitol Beltway in D.C. before traffic got too bad, and at this point, they rolled their window down, reached into their bag in the passenger seat, grabbed the murder weapon, and threw it out the window. The First chance they had, the killer turned around and sped back across the Maryland border. About 30 minutes after fleeing Eric's apartment, the killer walked back into Eric's apartment building, except this time, when they got in the elevator, they did not go up to the 6th floor. They went up to a lower floor. And then once they got to that floor, they got out of the elevator, walked down the hall, and went inside of their own apartment. And once they were inside, they showered, put on a nurse's uniform, and went right back downstairs to go to work. Katrina Ben, Eric's basketball-loving, casual romantic partner, was Eric's killer. It would turn out Katrina wanted a lot more out of her relationship with Eric. She did not like the idea of it being casual. And the week before the murder, Eric had blown off Katrina on a night they were supposed to hook up. Katrina knew Eric was out with actually another woman, and she told him she was not okay with that. But Eric was just not ready to be in a fully committed relationship with Katrina. In fact, he didn't even want his family to meet her. So Katrina started to feel like Eric was only using her for sex, and it made her really angry. So angry that she decided she would kill him. When Katrina first arrived at Eric's apartment to watch the basketball game, she had the gun with her, but she just wasn't sure if this night was going to be the night that she actually followed through. But Eric's impromptu drug deal gave Katrina potential cover. She could make up a story and say the dealer had shown up at Eric's apartment and seemed really suspicious, and basically make it seem like the drug dealer had killed Eric. However, the dealer, William Woodfork, had nothing to do with the murder. He had never even been to Eric's apartment. It took Detective Reuven tracking down the gun that was used to kill Eric and delving into the gun's history to finally discover Katrina was the killer, because he had traced the gun back to a pawn shop in a small rural town in Mississippi that just happened to be Katrina's hometown. Now, at this point, Reuven was very sure Katrina was the killer. However, he needed a receipt that showed she was the one who bought this gun last. But when he went to the pawn shop in Mississippi, those sales records were in that shed getting destroyed by rats, and so they had been shipped to the ATF. But Reuven was able to get those records from the ATF, and as soon as he looked through them, he saw right there Katrina's name was on the record. She had bought the murder weapon. She definitely was the killer. And so Katrina would be arrested at her parents' house in Mississippi, and she would be found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 20 years with no chance for parole. To this day, Eric's family say it was Reuven's patience and determination that ultimately got justice for their little brother and gave the family some sense of closure. In 2010, Jan Maccabee was living with her husband Bruce in a town called Lima, Ohio, which is approximately 80 miles southwest of Lake Erie. While Jan had built a successful career as a booking agent for musicians, bands, and entertainers, her real passion was deer hunting. So on September 29th of that year, right after deer hunting season had opened in Ohio, Jan decided to go out on a hunt. That morning had been cold and damp and gray, but by that afternoon, when Jan was getting ready to go, the temperatures had risen and the sun had come out. Jan's preferred method of hunting was to sit and watch from a tree stand, which is a ladder that you put in the woods that sits about 15 feet high. She would sit up there with her bow and arrow and wait to take a shot when a deer came by. Around 5 p.m. that day, she told Bruce she was leaving, and she made it to her tree stand by about 5:30. The forest she was going to be hunting in was one she was very familiar with, and it was not very remote. There were a couple houses just outside the woods, there were some agricultural areas, and her nephew actually went to high school just a mile north of these woods. But from the tree stand where she was sitting, all she could see around her was trees. Shortly after Jan sat down, she started texting with one of her friends on her BlackBerry, and periodically she'd poke her head up and look for deer. There weren't any, and then she'd go back to texting. The whole time this is happening, Jan can hear birds and crickets and squirrels and all the sounds of the forest all around her. A little after 6 p.m., her texting conversation with her friend reached a natural conclusion, and so she went back to just kind of sitting in the tree stand looking around. By about 6:20 p.m., she still hadn't seen any deer, and she was starting to get bored, so she decided she would take a selfie. She picked up her BlackBerry. She took the selfie, and as soon as she was done, she became aware that the forest had suddenly gone completely quiet. No more squirrels, no more birds, no more crickets, just complete silence. And she knew as a hunter the only time this happened was when a large predator was in the area and all the other animals went quiet. But Jan would later say there was just something different about this silence. It was so sudden and so complete that it scared her. And she wound up sending another text message to that friend she'd been texting earlier that said the woods just went completely silent. Very odd. As soon as Jan hit send on that text message and lowered her phone, she immediately became aware of something about 20 feet away in the tree that was right across from her. And she said it was the most unusual and terrifying thing she had ever seen. Moving left to right through the branches was this thing that she described as like a visual distortion. She said it was like looking across pavement on a really hot day and seeing that mirage, except this one looked like it was alive, like it had mass, like it was a see-through person that had been wrapped in saran wrap. And so Jan thinks it's a floater in her eyes, and so she rubs her eyes, and when she looks up, this thing has now moved down a branch closer to her and has stopped, like it's perched on the branch, staring at her. And Jan's horrified, but she knows she wants to document it, so she grabs her phone and she raises it up and she takes a picture on her BlackBerry right as this thing kind of disappears behind the tree and vanishes. Just seconds after this thing disappeared, all the sounds in the forest came back. The birds, the squirrels, the crickets, it was all back to normal, but Jan was really shaken up because she just could not make sense of what she just saw. So she just continued to stare in the general direction of where this thing was for several minutes, until finally she felt like it was safe again, at which point she brought her phone up to look at the picture she had taken. When she looked at it, it looked like a blurry mess, and so she thought, oh, I blew it, I put my hand over it, or my hair got in the way of it, or something. But at the same time, she's thinking to herself, but my hair didn't get in the way of it, and I very clearly held it out in front of me and know that I was looking at my phone when I took it, and I had a clear shot of this thing, so I don't really understand how this photo got so messed up. But after looking at the picture for a little while, she started to kind of laugh at herself, the idea that she'd just seen a saran wrap person running through the treetops. She just felt like that didn't happen. It must have been in my head, and as for this picture, I probably just blocked the lens, and that's it. That night, when Jan got back to her house, she did not tell her husband Bruce about what happened to her in the tree stand because, again, she's telling herself it was all in her head. They have dinner, they clean up, they sit down in the living room, and they're both on their phones, and they're just kind of scrolling through the internet and their emails, and at some point, Bruce reacts to something he's reading. He makes a sound. And Jan hears him and says, oh, what are you looking at? And he said, I just got a really interesting email from our nephew, the one that goes to school down the road. He said that today they were outside for band practice, and at some point all of them turned to look at the forest, and there was a bright circular light that was kind of hovering in the forest, and I guess they all stared at it for about 5 or 10 seconds, and then at some point the light kind of went back into the forest, and they didn't know what to make of it. And I guess one of his classmates said that a year before the exact same thing happened, and it apparently scared their instructor so badly that they canceled rehearsal and went inside because of it. As Jan is listening to her husband read this email, she's sitting up and her heart is racing, and as soon as he finishes, she says, what time did he say that happened? Bruce picked up how intensely she was asking him, and so he looked at the email, looked back at his wife, and was like, it was between 7:50 and 8. Why? At this point, Jan revealed everything that had happened to her while she was hunting, seeing that visual distortion in the trees that looked like a figure of some kind. And she would tell him that the forest she was in was the same one their nephew was claiming to have seen this circular light floating inside of. She told him she tried to take a picture of the thing she saw, but the picture didn't come out. But her husband, who is an optical physicist and therefore an expert at analyzing a picture, said, here, let me take a look at it. As soon as he looked at the image, the first thing he asked her was, well, did your hair get in front of the lens? And she said, no, I was holding it about a foot away from my head, and my hair was in a ponytail and a ball cap, so that can't be my hair. And so he looked at it again, and he asked her, well, did you put your finger over the lens, maybe? And she said, yeah, I might have. I don't think I did, but it's certainly possible. And so not really thinking much of this picture, he decides before giving the phone back to just check the resolution of the image, because whenever he would examine a picture, that was something he would do, and he discovered an anomaly. It turns out Jan's BlackBerry was only capable of taking pictures in 3 distinct resolutions. Basically, the size of the image could only come in small, medium, or large. And this picture she had taken of this thing she saw in the trees was a resolution size that was not small, medium, or large. It was some random size that the phone was actually not capable of producing. And so he asked his wife, did you manipulate your resolution settings?
And she said, "No, I don't even know how to do that." So Bruce looked at the other couple of pictures she had taken that day, and all of those fell into the small, medium, or large resolution size. It was just this one picture that was a total anomaly. And so Bruce was suddenly really intrigued by this image and by his wife's story. And so he continued to study the image, and he kept asking his wife questions about, how she was positioned in the tree stand and where the sun was and how far away this thing was and everything about the whole layout. And eventually Bruce started conducting experiments to see if he could duplicate this image his wife had created. And he got pretty scientific about it, and he could not duplicate it. Ultimately, because Bruce trusts his wife did not alter the photo in any way, and he trusts his wife as being truthful about what she experienced in the tree stand, what she saw, and based on his years of being an optical physicist, Bruce believes whatever was in the trees distorted this image. That even if she had put her finger over the lens, which he doesn't think she did, and she doesn't think she did, the picture resolution was altered in such a way that something had to have an effect on it. There was a third-party effect on this picture.
Our next story is called Hellhound. On the evening of August 1st, 2015, a 20-year-old man named Fraser Baloyi walked alone down a main road toward his village in the South African province of Limpopo. Fraser was on his way home from work, and he was pretty desperate to get there. It was only about 7:30 p.m., and usually around this time, Fraser was used to seeing other people out and about on this road, just kind of walking around in the dusk or, chatting or doing various errands, but tonight there was nobody out there. And in fact, in recent days, this area of Limpopo had basically become a ghost town. Nobody went out unless they absolutely had to, because over the last 10 days, over 20 people in this area had been brutally mauled. The victims had all insisted that the creature that had mauled them was some kind of four-legged demon, and they had begun calling it the Beast. Now, Fraser considered himself a pretty level-headed person who did not necessarily buy into the hype around this beast. He figured it was very likely just a dog. But still, he didn't want to get attacked, and so as he walked down this vacant road, he periodically looked over his shoulder just to make sure no dog was following him. As Fraser continued to walk along, he looked up and saw the huge forest fire that was raging on a mountain miles and miles off in the distance. A few days ago, the fire had started, and from Fraser's perspective, it still seemed to be going strong. In fact, in the darkness, it almost looked like the mountain was glowing red. Just then, Fraser noticed the turnoff for the shortcut that would take him through some forest back to his home, and when he got there, he stopped and looked over his shoulder one more time to make sure he was still all alone, and he was. And then he stepped off the main road, into the woods, and into the darkness. Under the tree canopy, the night suddenly seemed a lot darker. Fraser did his best to think about the chores he needed to do for his mother once he got home, instead of thinking about the beast. But he'd only been on this path for about 300 feet when he suddenly heard a rustling from behind him. And so right away, Fraser stopped and turned around and looked where the noise was coming from. But all he saw was darkness. There was nothing there. And so Fraser, for a whole minute, just stood there staring out into the tree line, waiting for something to move, but nothing did. And so Fraser told himself he was just being paranoid. Everything was fine. Then he turned back around and kept on walking. But pretty quickly, his walk turned into a jog. And he was almost to the end of this path, almost out of the forest. He could see his village. It was right there. When he heard noises behind him again. Except now, in addition to the rustling sounds, he heard a new sound. It was like a wheezing sound, like a sick animal that was breathing heavily. Now, Fraser knew he was not just being paranoid. Something was out there, and it seemed like it might be following him. Without slowing down, Fraser looked over his shoulder again to see what was out there, but again, he just saw nothing. It was just shadows. However, when he turned back around and kept on going towards his village, he heard this loud crashing sound behind him, like a massive animal had leapt out of the brush and landed on the path behind him.
And so Fraser was immediately so scared he couldn't even turn around. He just started sprinting toward the village, and all he could hear behind him were these loud, pounding footsteps as whatever this was gaining on him. And so Fraser was so instantly terrified that instinctively he just started sprinting off without even looking behind him. And so as he's running, this thing's gaining on him, and again he can hear this awful wheezing sound coming from whatever this is, as if there was something wrong with its lungs. And in Fraser's panic, as he's sprinting through the forest, Fraser's telling himself it's just gotta be a rabid dog, that's why it's making those sounds. But he knew that didn't track. This thing is huge. This can't just be a rabid dog. And so Fraser just kept on running, and finally, he got out of the trees, back into his village, and at the exact same moment, the pounding footsteps behind him came to a stop. But again, Fraser, he didn't turn around, he's too scared. He just ran for his door. His house was right there in front of him, and he gets to his door, he's about to open it up, and right as he does, he feels this searing pain in his neck. This creature, whatever it was, had leapt and grabbed onto him and bit down on the back of his neck. And so Fraser crumpled to the ground and threw his arms up over his head to protect himself, and with one eye, he can see it's this massive black creature on top of him, chewing on the lower half of his face. And so Fraser, he couldn't even feel any pain. He just began screaming for help, and he tried to push it off of him, but he couldn't. And then a second later, a flash of metal came across his eye as his mother and other villagers who had seen this happening and heard him screaming came out and began smashing whatever this was with shovels. And so a second later, Fraser's pulled away and dragged towards his house, and this huge black creature, it marched over to the edge of the tree line and just stopped, turned, and looked back at Fraser and his mother and the neighbors. And Fraser, as he's sitting there in total shock, he can tell that whatever this thing is, this enormous dog-like creature, this had to be the beast. That's what just attacked him. And in this moment, Fraser realized, this creature may have the shape of a dog, but it was not a dog. South Africa has its share of wild dogs, jackals, and hyenas, and typically they're multicolored and fairly small. And this thing was jet black, pitch black, and gigantic. And when this thing first started chasing Fraser, he'd had that panicked thought that maybe it was a rabid dog. But rabid animals are typically lethargic and confused, and this thing that was 15 feet away from them was absolutely alert and calm. The only thing sick about it was that horrible wheezing sound it would make as it breathed. And as Fraser and his mother and the neighbors just stood there staring at this thing, this creature just continued to stare back at them with piercing eyes. And its eyes were not normal. These were not like animal eyes or dog eyes. They were too small and set at the wrong angle. And there was real sentience behind them. They were human eyes. Just then, Fraser's mother grabbed Fraser and yanked him, kind of jerking him back to reality, and he scrambled to his feet, and he and his mother and the two neighbors, they took off running back into their respective homes. All the while, this creature just sat there on the edge of the forest, staring still in the direction of Fraser and his home. Once inside of Fraser's house, his mother immediately dialed the emergency number to tell the police about what had just happened, but the police told her they were not going to send people out there to deal with some dog. And so Fraser's mother decided she would just treat her son's wounds on her own until this dog-like creature had left, and then once it had, she would get him a ride to the hospital. However, as Fraser and his mother stared out the window at this creature, it didn't leave. It just sat there staring back at Fraser and his mother with these hideous human eyes for hours and hours. Finally, in the morning, it was gone. The attack on Fraser was the last straw for the people of his village. They believed the creature that had bit his face was the demon beast that had hurt so many other people. And so the elders of Fraser's village came up with a plan of how to deal with this beast. And so a few days after the attack on Fraser, this group of elders went off on a journey up into that mountain that Fraser had seen off in the distance that had that huge forest fire on it. And they were there for 2 whole days before returning to the village and telling everyone that they had successfully performed a ritual that had appeased their ancestors, and so hopefully now the attacks would stop. And sure enough, they did. They did not see the beast again. At least 40 people in Limpopo had encountered the beast at some point, either because they were attacked or they helped fend it off, like the neighbors did with Fraser. But because this beast was never caught and it did stop attacking the village and just kind of disappeared, nobody ever actually figured out what it was. To this day, people in Fraser's village maintain that this creature was a demon and that it came down from the burning mountain. Because every person, including Fraser, who had encountered this beast, noted its wheezing heavy breathing, as if its lungs had been damaged by smoke. In all, at least 40 people in Limpopo encountered this beast, either because they were attacked or they helped fend it off. But because it was never caught, there is no definitive proof of what it actually was. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Swampstalker. Just after midnight on May 1st, 1971, a 20-year-old woman named Elizabeth Ford was sleeping on a couch in the front room of a small house near a city in Arkansas called Texarkana. Elizabeth and her husband Bobby were staying at the house with Bobby's brother and his wife, who owned the house. Bobby and his brother were still both awake, and Elizabeth could hear them talking in the kitchen quietly. The house was surrounded by woods and swampland, and Elizabeth had opened up a window above the couch so a breeze was blowing in. Now, usually she slept really well with the sound of the woods in the background, but tonight she was tossing and turning. And this was because, as she lay there trying to sleep, she became very aware of a unique sound coming from outside that was not the sound of, the trees blowing in the wind or the insects buzzing. This was something else. It was a slow creaking sound, and at first it kind of sounded like it could be out in the woods somewhere, but eventually Elizabeth realized this creaking sound was sort of moving back and forth, right outside on the porch below the open window. Suddenly, Elizabeth's eyes flew open and she looked at the window because this creaking sound had just intensified and then came to a stop on the immediate other side of this window, like there was something heavy right outside. Elizabeth sat up to face the window, but she didn't see anything outside through the screen. And so right away she felt totally relieved. She didn't know what that sound was, but clearly there was nothing there. However, just to be certain, she decided she would go a little bit closer to the screen and actually look right up close to make sure there was nothing down below on the porch. And so Elizabeth leaned forward and pressed her face to the screen and began to look. And as she did, this dark figure down below suddenly rose up and completely blocked out the window. And Elizabeth's looking at it, having no idea what it is. And before she could do anything, this huge thing slashed at the screen, and this big reddish furry brown paw with razor-sharp claws cut through the screen and nearly cut Elizabeth's face. Elizabeth screamed and practically fell over, and this dark creature outside turned and bolted and disappeared. And then a moment later, Elizabeth's husband Bobby and his brother came running into the room asking what was going on. Elizabeth was so shocked at what she had just experienced that all she could say to her husband was, "It's a bear! It's a bear!" Bobby helped Elizabeth off the couch and then told her and his brother's wife to stay in the house and away from the windows. And then Bobby and his brother got shotguns and flashlights and went outside. Once outside, Bobby and his brother began scanning all around the porch area where Elizabeth had apparently seen this bear to see where it was. They held their flashlights out and they scanned the tree lines. They looked all over the place, all around the front of the property, but there was no sign of this animal. And so the brothers looked at each other and nodded, and then they both left the porch and went different directions, kind of looping around the back of the house. They were going to scan the entire property and meet up at the back. And when they met up at the back, they still hadn't found this bear, and so they walked away from the house towards the tree line and did another big sweep together of the entire perimeter, again looking for any sign of this animal, but there was nothing. And so after a while of circling the property, the brothers decided that, this bear must have just run off. And so Bobby and his brother returned to the porch to figure out their next move. Both Bobby and his brother were hunters, and they knew that usually the best thing to do with the bears that roamed this area was to leave them alone. I mean, these bears could grow to be 500 pounds, and if they were provoked, they could run at 35 miles an hour. And so generally, you just stayed away from these things, and they'd leave you alone too. However, as the brothers were sitting there talking through what had happened that night, they both said, it definitely seemed like this bear was different. I mean, apparently it was aggressive enough to come right up to the house unprovoked and reach in and swipe at Elizabeth, which obviously was not normal bear behavior. And so, to Bobby and his brother, this meant that they really couldn't just leave this bear alone. They had to go out there and find it and kill it to protect themselves. And so Bobby lit a cigarette to calm his nerves, and then the two brothers came up with a plan for how they were going to go find this bear. Bobby's brother would man the front of the house, and Bobby would man the back of the house, and they would stay in their respective positions monitoring the property until either they saw the bear and dealt with it, or until the sun came up, at which point they could go get help. And so after agreeing to this plan, Bobby took one final drag on his cigarette, chucked it to the ground, and then with his shotgun in one hand and his flashlight in the other, he stepped off the porch and walked around to the back of the house and stared off into the darkness. Bobby had only been in the back of the house for a couple of minutes manning his post when he began to smell this horrible smell. Now, at first he thought it was just some sort of wet, musky smell that came over from the swampland nearby, but as he continued to smell it, it got heavier and more pungent. It smelled like a wet, decaying animal. Bobby tensed up and aimed his flashlight up at the tree line and began looking back and forth, trying to figure out where this horrible smell was coming from. And as he was doing this, he suddenly heard the sound of tree branches snapping off to his left. And so he whipped his flashlight over and shined it, and he saw this big, dark figure charging across the property away from him into the forest. Bobby instinctively raised his shotgun and fired, and then after shooting, a loud yelp echoed in the air, and then Bobby just took off running in the direction he had just fired, and as he's running across the yard, he's screaming for his brother, who had already heard the shotgun blast, so he was coming around the house, and the two men linked up, and as they're running in the direction of this bear, Bobby's telling his brother, "I think I got it, I shot the bear." But they get over to where Bobby had last seen it and where he heard this yelp come from, and there was nothing, there was no bear. Still, the brothers did feel a little relieved. They figured even if they couldn't find this thing, clearly Bobby had hit it. He had heard the sound of it yelping out, and so maybe by at least wounding it, it would stay away and leave them alone. Just then, the men heard the sound of their wives screaming from inside the house. The men immediately ran back to the house, and as they got closer, Bobby again began to smell that horrible smell. And right as Bobby's foot hit that first porch step, his brother from behind him screamed out, "Stop!" But it was too late. The bear was on the porch. That's why the women were screaming. They had seen it, and Bobby's brother had seen it, but Bobby hadn't. And now he was too close to it to get away. And before Bobby could raise his gun to protect himself, this thing attacked. And Bobby felt this horrible burning, tearing sensation in his arm. He fell to the ground, twisting wildly back and forth, trying to protect himself. He was pinned underneath this enormous bear, level with its chest, with its arms and legs on either side of him. And that horrible smell he was smelling was clearly coming from this animal. That's all he could smell from underneath. But just then, it was like a miracle, because to his side, Bobby could see there was an opening, and so he rolled and somehow got out from underneath this enormous creature. Bobby scrambled up to his feet, and he darted past the bear and rammed into the closed front door of the house. It popped open, he fell inside, and his wife ran forward and shut the door behind him, leaving Bobby's brother outside on the porch alone with the bear. But before any of them could do anything about that, they heard the sound of his brother's shotgun going off. Then there was a long moment of silence. Inside the house, everybody was frozen. A few seconds later, the door slowly opened and Bobby's brother walked inside. Everyone was too shocked to say anything, so for a second they all just stared at each other, and then finally Bobby asked him, "Is the bear dead?" And Bobby's brother, with a trembling voice, said no, and that wasn't a bear. As soon as dawn broke and it was not dark outside anymore, Bobby's wife drove him to the hospital where they would treat him for shock and for the wound to his shoulder. They had hoped to find it somewhere on the property, either dead or wounded, based on Bobby's brother's account of having fired at it basically point blank, but the creature was gone. They did find its tracks though, and this discovery made it clear that Bobby's brother was right. This wasn't a bear. Because in the dirt surrounding the house, were all these bizarre footprints and handprints of a creature that seemed to walk on its hind legs with 3 toes on each and had 3 long, sharp claws on its hands. And as unbelievable as this all seemed to the police, this actually tracked with what Bobby's brother said he saw when he was out on the porch. He said he saw a creature with reddish-brown hair all over it that stood over 7 feet tall, and after being shot, it took off running on 2 legs, and it ran fast. But the most terrifying thing about it, at least according to Bobby's brother, was actually its eyes. They were blazing red. And when the news of this attack spread to the nearest town, which was called Fouke, the people there knew exactly what this creature was. For 200 years, people in that part of Arkansas had been talking about this huge creature that was sort of like a Sasquatch that roamed the forest and the swamps. They said it was fast and elusive, and it ate livestock and pets. They called it the Fouke Monster, or sometimes the Boggy Creek Monster. But Bobby Ford and his family's encounter with this creature was unlike any other story that had been told about the Fouke Monster. While some people claimed in the past that this creature had attacked people, nobody had ever heard of it actually coming up to somebody's house trying to break in and terrorize a family. Bobby's ordeal would inspire the 1972 horror movie, The Legend of Boggy Creek. Over the years, police officers and some scientists have suggested that maybe what Bobby and his brother encountered that night was actually a feral pig. However, authorities have never actually been able to pinpoint what this thing was. Nobody knows. And to this day, hikers and hunters near the swamps of southwest Arkansas and also across the border into East Texas still report run-ins with the legendary Fouke Monster.
A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.
In June of 2011, I had just failed a very stressful and anxiety-inducing underwater test as part of Navy SEAL training, and after I failed this test, my instructor told me to get out of the pool and go over to the corner with the other failures. And so I made my way to the edge of the pool, I climbed out, and I sulked my way to the corner where I saw my other classmates who had met a similar fate on this test. They were all sitting in the corner with their backs to the pool in neat rows. And so I was totally gassed from this test. And so when I sat down, I start dramatically breathing really loud and heaving my chest up and down to show off just how hard my test had been. And about 2 seconds into this ridiculous performance of mine, one of my other classmates who had been sitting in the corner when I showed up, a big 18-year-old kid from Wisconsin named Ephraim Matos, he immediately turned around and made eye contact with me, and through gritted teeth he just goes, "Shut up! Everybody here is in pain." And then he turned back around. And immediately, I was actually really mad at him because he just totally publicly dimed me out in front of my other classmates. But then it dawned on me, he was right. The job we were trying out for, Navy SEAL, they're not looking for people who just feel bad for themselves all the time. And so I never forgot the lesson Ephraim Matos taught me on the pool deck that day. And I, along with everybody else in the SEAL teams, never forgot the totally insane thing that Ephraim Matos did 5 years later that was picked up by virtually every major news network at the time. Back in 2012, so about a year after our exchange on the pool deck, Ephraim and I graduated and became Navy SEALs. I was assigned to an East Coast SEAL team and he was assigned to a West Coast one. And over the next 5 years, I never saw the guy until I saw him on TV. It was mid-June 2017 and I was on base in Virginia in an office full of other Navy SEALs, and we were wrapping up for the day. I was closing my email and powering down my computer, and I noticed my phone that was sitting on the table suddenly started lighting up with all these text messages from current and former teammates. So I grabbed my phone and all the messages said the same thing: turn on the news. And so in this office we were in, there was always a TV that was turned to the news sitting in the corner that was on mute. And so I turned to look at this TV, and on the TV from a distance, all I can see is breaking news and Middle East. And so given our profession, news like that tended to have a direct impact on our day-to-day lives. And so I assumed all these text messages must be about whatever happened in the Middle East. And so I get up, I walk over, I grab the remote, and on my walk back to my seat, I'm turning the volume up. And everybody else in the room is turning around to watch the TV as well. And we start hearing the TV reporters talking about this group of American civilians that had gone to Iraq and taken up arms against the terrorist organization ISIS. And so as they're talking about this group of American civilians, they put on the screen an image of one of these Americans. It was this big bearded guy in his mid-20s carrying an AK-47 rifle standing behind a tank somewhere in the Middle East. And as soon as I saw that picture, I knew right away why I had gotten that flurry of text messages from current and former teammates. It's because we all know this guy. The guy on TV was Ephraim Matos. 5 years earlier, after our graduation, Ephraim checked into his first SEAL team out on the West Coast, and very quickly after he showed up, they deployed to Afghanistan. During one of their missions, Ephraim was in the back of his patrol as they walked across this huge open field as they left this village they had just been in. And so Ephraim, in virtue of being in the back of the patrol, was in charge of looking behind the unit and make sure no one was coming after them. And so Ephraim periodically would turn around and he would look and make sure no one was following them. And then at some point when he turned around, he saw two little girls that couldn't have been more than 5 and 7 years old running out of the village and start running down the road towards them. Now, earlier in the day, when Ephraim and his team had been in that village, they had found a children's backpack lying in the middle of the road. And when they went up to inspect it, it turned out to be rigged with explosives. Now, no one had gotten hurt. They had defused the explosives, but they were very weary for children's backpacks. And so as Ephraim sees these two girls running up to him, he can see they're both wearing similar style backpacks to the one they found in the road. They were suicide bombers. Ephraim began screaming at these girls to stop, go back, don't come any closer, or I'll have to shoot at you. But he could tell they weren't stopping. They were just running up the road. He could see there were tears coming down their face. They were totally upset. They were obviously innocent. They were young kids. They'd been put up to this by the Taliban. But Ephraim, because he was in the rear security of his patrol, he had to deal with them like they were threats. And so at some point when they wouldn't stop, he raised his rifle up, he flipped the gun off safe, and he put his reticle right on one of the girls, and he began applying pressure to his trigger. But right as he was about to squeeze and fire a shot, the girls just abruptly stopped. It's like they knew they were about to be shot, and they turned around and they ran back towards the village. And so Ephraim put his finger off the trigger, he flipped it back on safe, he lowered his rifle, and he breathed a huge sigh of relief. But even though he didn't have to engage these poor girls, that experience totally haunted Ephraim. In fact, of all the combat he got in on that deployment, that experience with those innocent girls had the most impact on him. How could anybody force a child to be a suicide bomber? How could anyone be that cruel? And so by the time Ephraim came back to the United States after that deployment, he had changed. That experience specifically had changed him. Even though he believed in the US government's mission over in Afghanistan and in the Middle East, he felt like he could be doing more for these poor innocent people that were just trapped inside of conflict zones like these two little girls. And so over the next few years, he began looking at different conflict zones all over the world where civilians were in the most danger. And he discovered there was one place that was killing and exploiting civilians at an unprecedented rate. That place was Iraq, where a new terrorist organization had taken power, called ISIS. So in early 2017, when Ephraim's Navy contract ran out, and it was time for him to decide if he wanted to stay in the SEAL teams or get out and become a civilian, he opted to not re-enlist, so he left the military, and instead he got on social media and he contacted a foreign volunteer group in Iraq that was providing humanitarian aid to civilians. And he reached out to them and he said, "Hey, can I join you?" And of course they said, "Yes, we'd love to have a Navy SEAL come out and support us." And so just a couple of days later, Ephraim sold his house, he packed up a bag of clothes and a backpack, he grabbed his passport, and he hopped on a plane and he flew to northern Iraq all by himself. Now, before we continue the rest of the story, you need to understand just how bold this move was by Ephraim. Now, when he was a Navy SEAL, and so a member of the United States military on active duty, when he went to Afghanistan, to a war zone, he had lots of support. If his team got pinned down by the enemy, they could call in an airstrike, or they could call in backup. If Ephraim got hurt on the battlefield or his teammates got hurt on the battlefield, they could call in special medical teams that would fly in virtually any condition to come save them. And if Ephraim got captured by the enemy, you better believe America is coming for him. But in this case, Ephraim went to a war zone as a civilian. He was not in the US military, so he didn't have any of that support. If he or his team got pinned down out in Iraq, they would either have to fight their way out or get killed or captured. If he or one of his new teammates from this volunteer group got hurt, they would have to either save themselves or get killed or captured. And if Ephraim got captured as a civilian, nobody's coming for him. Nobody even knows he's been captured. He is completely on his own. But Ephraim knew these risks. In fact, he knew them better than most people because he had already deployed to a war zone and saw how important it was to have a support infrastructure. So when he flew to Iraq as a civilian, he knew he was hanging it out there, but he just didn't care. He felt like he had a mission to go help these innocent people because nobody else was. When he arrived in Iraq in March of 2017, he was met at the airport by one of the guys from this volunteer group Ephraim was going out to join. He was a very muscular, tattooed American in his mid-30s who introduced himself as Sky, and he said he had been a Marine, and while he was in the Marines, he had deployed to Iraq, so he was familiar with the area. The pair hopped in a vehicle, and Sky drove them to the volunteer group's safe house in the city, where Ephraim got a chance to meet the leader of this group. It was a tough-as-nails former Army Special Forces guy in his mid-50s named Dave. And Dave, for the past several decades, had been going out to conflict zones all over the world, and he would tell Ephraim that the worst atrocities he had seen committed against civilians in any of these places was where they were right now, in Iraq at the hands of ISIS. A few days later, Ephraim, Sky, Dave, and a few other American volunteers loaded up into this convoy made up of armored ambulances, and they left the city and they headed west into the countryside towards a huge city called Mosul that 3 years earlier had been captured by ISIS. On their journey towards the city, Ephraim and the others had to pass through a number of military checkpoints. Now, most of these checkpoints were stood up by their ally, the Iraqi army. But Ephraim and the others knew that they might stumble upon an ISIS checkpoint, and in virtue of all of them being pale-skinned Americans, they would instantly be recognized as the enemy and fired upon. So every time they slowed down for one of these checkpoints, Ephraim and the others would clutch their guns closely and mentally prepare themselves for a potential vicious close-quarters fight to the death. But luckily, they managed to go the entire distance all the way to the outskirts of Mosul without any checkpoint drama. And once they got there, they linked up with an Iraqi army unit that the leader of this volunteer group, Dave, had a relationship with. Over the first month that Ephraim was in country, he worked with this Iraqi army unit to help distribute food and provide medical care to civilians in and around Mosul. Then, in month 2 of his stay in Iraq, everything changed. Iraqi decision makers decided it was finally time to retake Mosul from ISIS. This was a huge military movement that required several units to work together and would take several weeks. The main Iraqi army was going to push inside of the city limits of Mosul and inch by inch reclaim territory from ISIS, while the army unit that Ephraim and his volunteer group had embedded with would be responsible for reclaiming some of the villages around Mosul that ISIS had occupied. And so suddenly, Ephraim and the rest of his volunteer group went from being humanitarian aid workers to having a direct frontline combat role with the Iraqi army. And in his first civilian combat experience, Ephraim ran across an active minefield towards this village that was occupied by ISIS. And after nearly being blown up at least 2 times, Ephraim finally made it to this village, and he began going house to house with the other volunteers, clearing them of ISIS fighters. And in one instance that he has on camera, he entered into this structure and he saw there were guns on the ground, and they looked around and they couldn't find any ISIS fighters inside, but they noticed on the ground there was a piece of plywood. They moved it aside and it revealed this huge hole that led down into the ground, and this hole connected to a huge underground tunnel system that ISIS used to escape gunfights just like this one. And so Ephraim and Dave, who was with him, just hopped right down into the tunnel. They didn't have night vision, they didn't have backup, just the two of them start running down this totally pitch black tunnel, periodically throwing grenades ahead of them in case there are ISIS fighters ahead of them. And at some point, after running for quite a while, just getting ready to come in contact with their adversaries, they reach this big, high-ceilinged cavern that's a dead end. And they're looking around thinking, okay, I guess no one ran in here. But before they turned around and left the tunnel system, they looked up with their lights and they saw high up on the wall, dug into the wall, was another entrance to another tunnel. It looked like there needed to be a ladder to get up to this additional tunnel entrance. And so Ephraim and Dave look at each other and they're thinking, I bet ISIS fighters ran down here, there was a ladder, they climbed up and went in that entrance and then pulled the ladder up so we can't follow them. And so Ephraim and Dave couldn't do anything about it. They decide, okay, well, we'll just go out and we'll tell the Iraqi army and see what they want to do. So Ephraim and Dave, they leave this tunnel system, they go back outside, they tell the Iraqi army, and the Iraqi army brings in a bulldozer and they fill in that entrance they had found inside of the house, completely seal it up so nobody could go in or get out. And then later that night, after that village had been cleared of all ISIS fighters, they began hearing muffled explosions underground near where this entrance to this tunnel was. And what it turned out to be was ISIS fighters that realized they had been buried alive. They had snuck down there. They had used a ladder to get up into that crawl space. But when they realized they were doomed, they blew themselves up. For the next month, Ephraim and the Iraqi army unit that he and his volunteers were working with continued to periodically get into small skirmishes with ISIS in these villages outside of Mosul, but the majority of their time was spent providing humanitarian aid and medical care to civilians in the area. Then in May, their mission changed again. The other Iraqi army units that had been sent directly into Mosul a month earlier to inch by inch eradicate the area of ISIS fighters, they had done a relatively good job, but the last few ISIS fighters had been pushed up into this northern section of the city where they had bunkered down inside of these blown out concrete structures, and they were putting up an unbelievably fierce fight. So fierce, in fact, that these Iraqi army units in the city were not able to go any farther forward. They needed armored vehicles and tanks if they were going to be successful. And it just so happened the army unit that Ephraim and his volunteer group had embedded with, that had been outside of Mosul this whole time, they were an armored unit. They had armored vehicles and tanks. And they were ordered to head right into the heart of Mosul and liberate it once and for all. And so on May 4th, Ephraim and the other volunteers loaded up in their armored vehicles, and they joined this huge line of dozens and dozens of tanks and other armored vehicles looking at the western side of Mosul. There was just a field between them and the city walls. And as soon as this massive convoy began moving forward towards the city just opened up on them. Heavy machine gun fire, rocket fire, mortars, it was just absolute chaos. ISIS knew they were coming, and so they were unleashing everything they had on them. And Ephraim would say, after his vehicle actually got inside of the city limits of Mosul and was on one of their roads, all these booby-trapped cars began detonating all around them, and the machine gun fire and rocket fire and mortar fire only intensified. At the same time this was happening, Iraqi civilians inside of Mosul saw this unbelievable wave of violence happening, and they began trying to flee the city. Now, ISIS had effectively kept them hostage inside of Mosul because they needed lots of civilians in and around the area because it prevented Iraq and America and other forces that were fighting ISIS from indiscriminately bombing Mosul to get rid of the ISIS presence there. And so when ISIS saw these civilians running away, they began shooting them to deter other civilians from trying to escape. And so right in front of Ephraim, as he's driving into the city, men, women, children are just being gunned down all over the place. Naturally, Ephraim and the other volunteers hopped out and tried to return fire at these ISIS shooters, but they were so well fortified in different structures, they couldn't even see them, let alone hit them. So they did the next best thing. Ephraim and the others began putting themselves out in the open to draw fire on themselves so that other nearby civilians could run to safety. And for the next 3 days, that's what they did. Constantly exposing themselves and dodging bullets, and then also when they weren't doing that, they were treating these civilians that had been wounded and other Iraqi soldiers that had been wounded. Now, to this point, Ephraim had seen combat when he was in the United States Navy as a Navy SEAL, and he'd seen combat as a volunteer with this group. But it wasn't until he got inside of Mosul that he saw just how barbaric humans can be to one another. He said he saw so much death and dying all around him that it was like his brain couldn't compute that level of barbarism. He would later write a book called The City of Death, and it was about his experience in Mosul. And he said the reason he named the book The City of Death is because that's what it felt like. Everywhere around him was just death. For the next several weeks, Ephraim and the other volunteers took up a position in the south section of Mosul inside of this bombed out building. They created a sort of aid station, and there they focused all of their attention on trying to treat as many wounded civilians and wounded Iraqi soldiers as they possibly could. At the same time, the rest of the Iraqi army had pushed north and was slowly chipping away at the last few ISIS fighters. On June 1st, so roughly 1 month after Ephraim and the others have entered into the city of Mosul, they noticed a significant uptick in the number of wounded civilians that were coming to them for help. And so all day and all night, they're treating all these people that are horribly wounded with gunshot wounds and other wounds. And so at some point, Ephraim and the others begin asking these people, what happened to you? This seems unusual that so many people would show up with these wounds, and they all just seemed to be in shock. No one was able to really talk about what happened, but a few people mentioned there had been a massacre somewhere nearby. But when they pried for more information, there was a language barrier issue, and there was just the fact that they were overwhelmed with patients, and they needed to make sure their focus was on treating them, not talking to them. The following morning, though, Ephraim and the others got up and decided they wanted to push farther north into ISIS-held territory to see if there was evidence of a massacre, to try to figure out what happened to all these people that were showing up wounded. And so Ephraim and the other volunteers, they left their aid station building and they moved north about 1 block to this huge intersection, and there they tucked up against this huge concrete wall that protected them from ISIS. ISIS was down the other road that ran through the intersection. They were holed up in this huge bombed out hospital that overlooked this intersection. And so from where they were, ISIS couldn't see them and they couldn't shoot them. At some point, Ephraim poked his head around this wall, looking down the road towards this burned out hospital, and what he saw along the road shocked him. There were dozens and dozens of civilians that had been killed laying all over the place. It would turn out the day before, a huge group of civilians had attempted to flee the city, and they ran in front of that burned out hospital where ISIS was, and they gunned them down. And they killed over 200 civilians, men, women, children, they didn't care, and they wounded at least 100 others. And so that was why there was that huge uptick in wounded civilians the day before. And so as Ephraim is scanning this carnage, being careful not to stay exposed for too long, he notices one particularly large pile of bodies. There's about 20 or 30 bodies. He sees in this pile, there's clearly movement. And he can see there is a little girl who's attempting to hide herself under her dead mother's clothing. And then next to this girl were 2 other adult men that clearly were wounded, but were alive. Ephraim immediately starts yelling to them to run to him, you're gonna get killed out there. But the 3 of them were completely shell-shocked. For the past 24 hours, they had been laying inside of this pile of bodies. And so they were not gonna be able to move on their own. And so Ephraim realized unless they did something to get them out of there, they were going to die. So Ephraim and the others ran back to their Iraqi army counterparts, and they got them to sign off on a rescue mission. And their plan was they would have one of the Iraqi tanks drive down that road straight towards that hospital where all the ISIS fighters were, and right behind the tank would be an Iraqi Humvee, inside of which would be Ephraim and the other volunteers. And so they would go straight down the road, the tank would serve as a sort of shield for the Humvee, and after the tank passed the pile of dead bodies, the Humvee would be lined up right next to it. Ephraim and the others would hop out, they'd grab the girl and the 2 other men, pull them back in the Humvees, and then the 2 vehicles would back up to safety. Once this plan was in place, Ephraim and Dave and the other volunteers contacted the American military in the area, and they got them to authorize a smoke screen. They would fire artillery shells with air-burst smoke grenades that would obscure the view of the ISIS fighters in the hospital. They wouldn't actually be able to see the tank or the Humvee or this rescue operation taking place right in front of them. And so shortly after these plans are totally finalized and Ephraim and the others are loading up in the Humvee and they're getting in position to turn that corner and begin this operation, the driver of the Humvee says, you know what? I don't want to do this anymore. It's not safe. I'm not willing to do it. Ephraim and the other volunteers tried to convince him to still do the operation because they didn't have time to get a replacement Humvee, and they had already coordinated with the American artillery units that were going to be firing these shells at a certain time, and so they really didn't have an opportunity to do this operation again if this guy backed out. Not to mention, if they didn't get out there quickly, these 3 people were going to die anyways. And so finally, when Ephraim realized this driver was not going to budge, he was not going to go in this operation, Ephraim and the others got out of the Humvee and they walked up to the tank driver and they asked him, are you still prepared to go on this rescue operation? And he said he was. And so even though if they went through with this mission, it would mean Ephraim and the others would be on foot behind the tank, completely exposed, they were still totally down for doing it. In fact, Ephraim would say at no point did they consider canceling the mission. They were so focused on saving these 3 people that they were prepared to sacrifice themselves to do it. And so the tank driver closed his hatch, Ephraim and the others got behind the tank, they turned that corner so they're facing the hospital, and then a couple minutes later, as planned, American artillery launched these airburst smoke grenades that totally obscured ISIS's view. And as soon as those smoke clouds were in the air, ISIS came out and just started firing randomly straight down in the general direction of where this tank was. They couldn't really see the tank. They had no way of knowing what they were doing out there. They just knew something was going on. And so meanwhile, Ephraim and the others are tucked up behind this tank as it's slow rolling in, as rounds are impacting all around them, mortars start landing all around them, and it turns out there were other ISIS fighters not just directly ahead of them in the hospital, but also off to their side in other buildings, so they were getting hit from 2 directions. Ephraim remembers as he was behind this tank trying to stay as small as he could, he began dry heaving because he was so terrified. He was completely convinced he was going to die that day. Eventually, the tank made its way just past this pile of bodies, and at that point, Ephraim actually stepped out and fired back towards ISIS in the hospital and over towards the berm to provide some cover fire, while Dave and another volunteer ran over and pulled the girl and the other 2 men out of the pile and behind the tank. The girl and one of the men were okay, they were not badly physically hurt, but the other man was badly hurt and he couldn't walk. And so thinking quickly, Ephraim and his team found a piece of sheet metal on the ground behind this tank, and they rolled him onto it and used it like a stretcher and began dragging him as the tank began moving in reverse. And so as bullets are still flying all around them, rockets are landing next to them, they're moving, they're making good progress, when the wounded man slips off of the sled, and he lands right in the tracks of where this tank is going to go. And for a variety of reasons, Ephraim and the others had no way of communicating with the tank driver. So the tank driver is just going to keep on moving and he's going to run over this injured man who can't go anywhere. And so thinking quickly, Ephraim leaps down, he grabs the injured guy, and he rolls with him out of the way of the tracks right as it goes past him. But now Ephraim and this wounded man are outside the protection of the tank, and rounds start impacting all around them. The smoke screen at this point is pretty much cleared, and so ISIS sees them. And Ephraim at this point makes a heartbreaking decision. He looks at this guy who he knows cannot move himself. He's badly wounded. He makes eye contact with him. He holds his hand, and Ephraim just shakes his head and says, "I'm sorry," because he knew he couldn't move him fast enough behind the tank before both of them got shot, and he couldn't throw him on his back in time before both of them got shot. And so he had to leave him. And so Ephraim jumped up, he leapt behind the tank right as a volley of fire hit right where he had been standing, and then Ephraim and the others continued moving back. That wounded man would go on to be killed by ISIS. Only a few moments after Ephraim was back behind the relative safety of the tank, he suddenly fell to the ground and felt a pain in his right leg. He had been shot through the leg. But where he fell was right in line with where one of these tank treads were coming, but again, they can't talk to this tank, so they can't stop the tank from running him over. And so a surge of adrenaline came over Ephraim, and he leapt up onto his feet and just continued hobbling behind the tank despite this gaping hole in his leg. Eventually, they made it all the way back to that intersection where they had started, but the only way they could get back down the alleyway to safety with the Iraqi army was to run across a small segment of this street. Basically, you needed to be exposed for just a second running across. But at this point, the smoke screen was gone. ISIS knew exactly where they were, and they were waiting for them to pop out from behind that tank. And so Ephraim and the other volunteers are screaming across this gap in the road towards the Iraqi army to get them to send an armored vehicle across this road, pick us up, and bring us back across. We can't run across this gap without getting shot. But because of the chaos and the noise, the tank is firing, there's mortars, there's rockets, there's gunfire, it's crazy, the message was just not received. And so in a sudden fit of madness and frustration and fear and all sorts of things, Ephraim just runs across the street. And he gets to the other side miraculously without being hit again. And there he tells the Iraqi army, send an armored Humvee across this gap, get the girl, get the guy, get the rest of the volunteers, save them. Seconds later, an armored Humvee crossed that gap, they picked them up and brought them back. And at this point, Ephraim is now lying on the ground behind that concrete wall, so he's relatively safe, and he's getting his leg bandaged up. And he remembers when the girl and the guy were brought out and they were safe and alive, the Iraqi army erupted in cheers. It was this unbelievably happy moment in an absolutely tragic, horrible time. The Iraqis would transport Ephraim in an armored ambulance to an aid station south of where this intersection was, and there they would put him on a cot, and a doctor would rebandage his leg, and then he would walk away. And so Ephraim is left inside of this room to kind of think about what had just happened, and he looked over to his left, and just 2 beds over from him was the girl he had just nearly died saving. And she was sitting on her cot, she wasn't looking at him, she was looking straight ahead, her dark hair was matted down, and she was just kind of staring into nothingness. It was clear she was still in shock, but she did look relatively unhurt. And then at some point, another Iraqi doctor came over and gave her some food and water, and she ate and drank ferociously. Ephraim just stared at her in awe. At that moment, she was the most important thing in his life. And as he's staring at this miracle child, the doctor that had given her food and water noticed him staring, and he came over to Ephraim and he just said, her name is Damoa, she's 4 years old, and she's going to be just fine. After the doctor had walked away, Ephraim pulled his hat down over his face and he just wept. Ephraim never had a chance to actually speak to Damoa because she was so scared of everyone around her that he decided to just give her her space. But he would later find out that she was reunited with her living family members, and today she is alive and well. After his injury, Ephraim was sent back to the United States, and it was then that he learned their rescue operation had been filmed by a guy who was there that day documenting war crimes by ISIS. He saw this rescue operation happening, and he just started filming it. After this man posted the footage online, it went viral, and before long, major news outlets all over the world were reaching out to Ephraim and the other volunteers for interviews. This was the story that me and my teammates in Virginia in that office saw in 2017, and that image we saw of Ephraim standing behind the tank with the AK-47, that was moments before he rushed out behind the tank and provided cover fire for Dave and the other to run over and grab the girl and the other 2 men. The gunshot wound that Ephraim sustained in his leg wound up being relatively minor, if you consider gunshot wounds to be minor. It did not hit an artery and it did not shatter his bone. And so after only a few months, he was more or less back to strength, and instead of just taking it easy, he was in another conflict zone in Burma, this time working with a new volunteer organization, one that he founded called Stronghold Rescue and Relief. And their mission is to protect and care for families in conflict zones. Their motto is, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Despite being a very small organization, they are having enormous impacts all over the world, but they need our help. They rely on a small army of people who pitch in small donations every month to keep operations flowing. So if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, please consider joining their army by supporting them on a monthly basis, just like I am. Also, if you just click on that link, it will bring you to their website, and you can see the full unedited footage of their rescue mission.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. Not just this one, but also Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Run Fool, and Wartime Stories. To find them, all you have to do is look up Ballin Studios on any podcast platform, and boom, you'll find them all. If you want to watch hundreds more stories just like the one you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. So that's